I am Isabella Turner, 46 years old, living in a quiet suburb of Portland, Oregon. To outsiders, my marriage to Thomas was the picture of perfection. A devoted wife, a successful husband, a 2-story white-painted house, and a lavender garden blooming each spring. We had been together for 19.5 years, almost 2 decades under the same roof, building a life I once believed would last forever. Thomas was the deputy CFO of a large real estate corporation, frequently traveling for work, busy with meetings and client dinners. I was a part-time fundraising director for a local nonprofit, working reduced hours so I could take care of our home, our golden retriever, and prepare cozy weekend dinners. From the outside, it probably looked like I was living a dream. But every dream can shatter, with just a single crack. The crack began with a phone call from the clinic. The doctor's voice came through the receiver, gentle but firm. "We've received your biopsy results, Ms. Turner. It's stage 2 breast cancer. The good news is, we caught it relatively early, and it's treatable with aggressive care." I sat frozen in my chair, the phone pressed to my ear, my heart pounding in my chest. I remember nodding over and over, thanking the doctor, even managing a small smile to stay calm, though my mind was completely blank. An hour later, I was still sitting on the bench outside, staring at the maple trees shedding their leaves, without really seeing anything. That night, I planned to tell Thomas. I had rehearsed how I'd say it, calmly, clearly, just the way he liked things, no drama, no emotional waves. But when I got home, the kitchen was cold, the lights were off, and there was no note on the table. I checked my phone. "Running late, go ahead and eat without me." That was the 4th time that week. I stood in the dark kitchen, hand pressed against my chest, where I knew something dangerous was quietly growing inside me. Part of me hoped Thomas would sense something, that some invisible thread between us would still pull at his heart. But it seemed he had stopped noticing a long time ago. The weeks that followed became a loop. Work, appointments, tests, consultations, all on my own. Thomas was the same, busy, phone glued to his hand, his eyes no longer warm when he looked at me. Some nights he came home without a word, not even a touch on my shoulder like he used to. I began to realize I wasn't an important part of his life anymore, just part of a perfect backdrop he was slowly stepping away from. Then one day I found a receipt from a romantic French restaurant, one where we had celebrated our 10th anniversary. But this time it wasn't with me. I found unfamiliar charges from a high-end jewelry store, concert tickets in Seattle I never received. I tried to convince myself Thomas was just stressed, that this was just a phase. But the more I held on, the more I realized I was clinging to an illusion. I lost a lot in those months, my trust, my sense of safety, my health, and the man I once thought would grow old with me. But I never said a word, not once. I still hadn't told Thomas I was sick, that part of my body would have to be removed to keep living. I was still waiting for a moment, a sign of care, a simple question like, "Are you okay?" But that moment never came. Then one Thursday, while I was choosing a nail polish color at a little salon near home, pretending that self-care could somehow distract me, I got a message. "Dinner at Lucille's tonight, there's something important I want to talk about." I stared at the words, a tight knot forming in my chest. Something told me, this time, I wasn't the one being checked on. I was the one who would be listening. Lucille sat tucked in a quiet corner of downtown Portland, warm yellow lights casting a soft glow on white tablecloths and little lavender vases. It used to be our favorite place, where Thomas had proposed to me on a fall evening nearly 20 years ago. So when I walked in, my heart tightened. Not because of the romantic ambiance, but because I knew there would be no ring waiting for me this time. Thomas was already there, sitting at a window table in his neatly pressed gray suit and wine-colored tie, the one I had picked for his birthday on our 10th year together. As I approached, he stood up, a smile on his face that didn't quite reach his eyes. I pulled out my chair, the air around us thick. Something in his gaze had changed. No tenderness, only a cold distance I couldn't explain. "You're here," he said, trying to keep his voice light. "You said it was important," I replied, trying to stay composed, even though my chest was tightening. We ordered out of habit. I chose the French onion soup, he got the chicken with wine sauce. The waiter poured our drinks and slipped away, leaving behind a silence that sat heavily between two people who used to be husband and wife. "Isabella," Thomas began, eyes on the window, where streetlights flickered against the glass. I think it's time we had some space. I froze. The phrase wasn't unfamiliar. I had heard friends say it when breaking up, but I never thought it would be the prelude to my own ending. Space? I repeated, my voice low and clear. Are you talking about divorce? He nodded, never once meeting my eyes. We've changed, he continued like he was reading from a script. I've tried, really. But I feel like I'm not myself anymore, and I think it's better for both of us if we end it here. I set my spoon down, my palms slick with cold sweat. I hadn't told him about the diagnosis. I hadn't told him I just had a surgical consult with my doctor. I had hoped this would be the moment we reconnected, that the fragility of life would remind him what truly mattered. Is there someone else? I asked, the words slipping out instinctively. He hesitated, only for a few seconds, but that was enough. What's her name? I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I just wanted the truth, plain and clear. Savannah, he exhaled. The new assistant at the office? I nodded, like I'd just heard the name of an old acquaintance. A young blonde woman, always smiling brightly whenever I visited Thomas's office. I remember thinking she was sweet and efficient. I never imagined she'd be the reason my marriage collapsed. Thomas pulled a business card from his jacket and placed it gently on the table. This is my lawyer's info. I've arranged everything to be as smooth and convenient for you as possible. We can do this peacefully. You deserve that. I looked at the card. Light gray, black print, neat and serious. A part of my life had been reduced to a legal transaction, and the man across from me wasn't my partner anymore. Just a negotiator, finalizing a deal. Do you know I was just diagnosed with cancer? I asked, my voice so calm even I was surprised. Thomas looked up, panic flashing in his eyes for a moment. But I didn't let him speak. Oh right, I never told you. I was waiting for the right moment. But it seems that moment never existed. I stood up, smoothing my dress. Thank you for dinner, I said, a brief smile crossing my lips. And thank you for confirming. You're no longer someone who deserves to know anything more about my life. I walked away, leaving behind a full plate and a silent man. The golden lights at Lucille's didn't feel warm anymore. Everything had changed. And from that night on, I knew I wasn't just fighting an illness. I'd have to learn how to live again. Without Thomas, without illusions, just me, and the truth. The man I once loved was no longer there. I received the divorce papers from Thomas's lawyer's office 3 days after that dinner at Lucille's, a thick envelope neatly stamped sitting on the kitchen table like a cold punctuation mark to nearly 20 years of marriage. I stared at it for hours. Didn't open it, didn't cry, didn't get angry. Just an expanding emptiness in my chest, like someone had quietly pulled the core out of the life I once knew. I sat down, made a cup of hot tea, and opened the envelope like someone flipping through an old book whose ending they already knew. Every sheet inside was a small paper cut, splitting assets, dividing retirement accounts, assigning value to every piece of furniture we had once picked out together. Even the sapphire necklace Thomas gave me during our 17th anniversary trip to Napa Valley was listed as a high-value item, to be divided fairly. I read everything, signed without a tremble. No objections, no lawyer, no arguments, no negotiation. But it wasn't surrender. It was the first step. I folded the papers, placed them in the return envelope, stamped it, and dropped it in the mailbox the next morning. Right after that, I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in nearly 6 months. I think it's time, Uncle Walter, I said when the familiar voice picked up. I need to talk to you. Walter Caldwell, Thomas's father, was a respected man in his 70s, a retired history professor from a prestigious university. After his wife passed away, he moved into a cabin by a lake in the southern suburbs of Eugene. He was the only one in Thomas's family who truly loved me like his own daughter. While Thomas grew distant, Uncle Walter still called monthly, sent handwritten Christmas cards, and never missed mailing me a jar of his homemade orange marmalade each winter. When I arrived at his home that afternoon, Walter was sitting on the porch, holding an old book, silver-rimmed glasses slipping slightly down his nose. "You're here," he said, warmth and concern in his eyes. I figured I knew why. I nodded, sitting in the wooden chair across from him. "I'm not here to complain," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "I just think it's time I knew the whole story." Walter stayed silent for a few moments. A soft breeze carried the scent of pine across the lake. "What did Thomas tell you?" he asked. "He said he needed space," I replied, curling my lips slightly. "And apparently that space now has a name. Savannah." Walter sighed and set his book down on the wooden table. "I saw it coming for a while," he said slowly. "I had hoped that girl was just a passing phase, but seeing how cold Thomas has been toward you lately, I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore." I gripped the arm of the chair gently, but said nothing. I needed him to continue. "After his mother passed, I changed the will," Walter went on, eyes locked on mine. "Thomas is my only son. He was supposed to inherit everything. This house, the ranch in Wyoming, and all the investment accounts I've built over my lifetime. But," he paused, "I added a condition." I held my breath. "Thomas forfeits his inheritance if he initiates a divorce from you without just cause, and that cause," he emphasized, "must be clear misconduct on your part, infidelity or significant harm. Without concrete proof, the entire inheritance is redirected to the community education fund I created in his mother's name." I stared at him, stunned. "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything, Isabella," Walter smiled gently. "I did it because I saw it plain as day. You gave more than you got. You sacrificed too much for this family, and I couldn't let Thomas walk away without consequences." I left Walter's house with a notarized copy of the will clause tucked in my bag, my heart pounding in my chest. For the first time in months, I felt like the scales were shifting. Not out of revenge, but because, for once, I had the chance to rise without being left empty-handed. Outside, the golden light of evening bathed the lake. I tilted my face toward the sun. An ill woman, a wounded woman, but one who was awake now. And from that moment on, I knew one thing for sure. Thomas thought he was walking out of our marriage on his own terms. He was wrong. I spent the rest of that evening in my study, desk lamp casting light across the documents Walter had given me, cutting through the thick fog I'd been living in. The words were clear, notarized, and backed by an attorney's signature. Clause 14, the so-called moral condition, wasn't just a footnote. It was the linchpin of the entire will. It read, "In the event that the direct heir, Thomas Caldwell, initiates a divorce from Isabella Turner Caldwell without legal proof of misconduct by the spouse, all inheritance rights shall be rendered void. The listed assets will be transferred directly to the Caldwell Education Foundation." Fewer than 200 words, yet enough to erase the entire empire Tolman assumed he would inherit. I set my pen down and leaned back, my chest hollow but my eyes sharp. All these years I'd thought of myself as the one behind the curtain, the quiet support. But no one knew I was also the one who could bring down the whole stage Thomas had built to play the perfect man. He thought he had slipped away neatly, a clean retreat into a shiny new life with Savannah, the blonde assistant who smiled on cue, walked just right, and knew how to bow to power. But there was one thing Tomas never did: read carefully. I remembered the one time I suggested we review the family financials and estate plan after his mother died. Thomas had scoffed and said, "Dad's got it. I've got 100 emails to answer." Now that carelessness was going to cost him. I called Judith Raines, my mother's best friend and a retired attorney. She had been one of the first female judges appointed in Oregon and had always kept close tabs on my life. "I think I need a strategy," I said over the phone, my voice steady and low. "A strategy to protect yourself," Judith replied. "Or to remind someone that you're not to be underestimated." "Both," I answered without hesitation. 3 days later, Judith and I met in her daughter's law office, her daughter being an expert in estate law, to ensure the will clause I held was legally valid. They verified records from Walter's lawyer's office in 2018, checked the notarization date, his mental competency at the time, and finally concluded this clause is fully enforceable and cannot be dismissed by a simple challenge. It felt like I could breathe again after months in a windowless room. "So what do you want to do with it now?" Judith asked, gently turning her white porcelain coffee cup. I paused, then smiled. "Not yet," I said. "I'm not going to use it like a sword, but like an hourglass. And Thomas will get to watch every grain of sand fall." Together we prepared a notarized copy, sealed and stored it in Judith's safe. I also asked the law office to prepare a written legal confirmation of its validity, not to be sent, just kept. I wanted Thomas to think he was winning. I wanted him to believe he had it all figured out, from the divorce to the new house to the glamorous engagement party by Crystal Lake where his father once took me for the first time 14 years ago. Everything going to plan. Except he had built it all on the wrong foundation. A few weeks later, when I happened to see a photo Savannah posted on social media, a picture of her showing off a diamond ring with the caption, "She said yes," I didn't feel anger. I felt calm. The ring looked strikingly similar to a piece from my former mother-in-law's collection, once locked away in Walter's safe. A small detail, but enough to tell me, Thomas had started dividing assets as if they were already his. He still didn't know that every piece of it, every brick, every acre, every account, was just a castle in the sand without my consent. I stood up and left the cafe where I had been sitting, the afternoon sun casting my silhouette across the wooden floor through the glass. The game was on, but this time I held the cards, and I wasn't going to show my hand early. I wanted to wait for the right moment. The moment Thomas believed he had it all, only to find out he had more to lose than he ever imagined. On a quiet June afternoon, while I was reading on my porch, my phone buzzed. A message from Alyssa, a former colleague of Thomas, appeared, with just 4 words. "Have you seen this?" along with a link to a public Instagram post. I wasn't prepared for what I was about to see. In the photo, Savannah stood arm in arm with Thomas in front of the lakeside estate in Bend, the Caldwell family's generational summer home. The spring sky behind them was bright and blue. Beside the image, a short caption and heart emoji. "We're engaged. See you all at the celebration this weekend at Lake Caldwell." I read it over and over, as if repetition could change the outcome. Celebration this weekend? At the house that was once my safe haven? No mention of the past, no sign of the memories that once existed between me and Thomas there. Just a new beginning, sunlit, flower-filled, and strangely rushed. Savannah didn't know, or had conveniently forgotten, that the estate couldn't belong to Thomas, not if he unilaterally ended our marriage. But instead of anger, I felt clarity. That was the moment I knew it was time to act. 3 days later, I met Judith again in her daughter's office to prepare the necessary documents: a copy of the will, notarized clause, legal confirmation from Walter's law office, all neatly compiled and sealed in plastic. "I want to do this calmly," I said, looking at Judith. "No drama, no spectacle. I just want the truth revealed, at the right time, in the right place." "Are you ready?" she asked. "Every bit of me," I replied. That night I stood in front of the mirror and chose a sapphire blue dress. Nothing too flashy, but enough to turn a head. My hair was shorter now, streaked with a few grays, curled neatly. I wore little makeup, just a touch of deep red lipstick and the pearl earrings Walter had given me on the 12th anniversary of our marriage. On Saturday morning I drove to Bend. The scenery shifted from busy streets to whispering pine trees and the lake shimmering in the distance. I pulled up to the estate gate at exactly 3:40 p.m. The party had started at 3, meaning guests were mingling, but the champagne hadn't dulled their attention yet. I took a deep breath, retrieved the ivory envelope from my bag and stepped out of the car. On the lawn, white tents were set up, balloons and fresh flowers everywhere. A jazz band played an old love song, and guests, many of whom I recognized, were raising glasses in the soft northwest summer sun. No one noticed me at first until I moved closer to the center, where Tomas and Savannah stood under a white floral arch hand in hand, accepting congratulations. I stopped a few steps away, waiting for Savannah to turn, and when she did, her eyes met mine. She froze, her grip tightening on Tomas's hand. He followed her gaze, and I saw his expression change. "Isabel," said, almost instinctively, "what are you doing here?" I smiled, calmly but with certainty. "Congratulations to you both," I said, placing a hand on the envelope. "I just came to deliver a little gift, especially for you, Thomas." Savannah stepped forward, her voice firm. "You weren't invited." "Don't worry, I'm not staying," I replied, eyes still on Thomas. "I just thought there are a few things you should read before you pop the champagne." I held out the envelope. He didn't reach for it, but his eyes didn't leave it either. I handed it to a nearby guest I knew would pass it along. "Inside is a copy of your father's will clause, I said, my voice low but just loud enough for a few guests nearby to take notice. It clearly states if you divorce me without proof of wrongdoing, your entire inheritance becomes void, including this house. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The music from the jazz band faltered, replaced by murmurs rippling through the crowd. Thomas turned pale, his hand tightening around his wine glass. Savannah looked at him, eyes full of confusion. "Did you know about this?" she asked, her voice rising. Thomas said nothing. I gave one final smile and turned to leave, feeling the eyes of dozens behind me. I didn't need to stay and watch what would unfold. I had planted the seed of truth. Now it would grow on its own? A breeze swept across the lawn, gently rustling the white drapes around the floral arch. The once festive, buzzing air now felt frozen. All eyes were on me, the woman cast out of Thomas's life, suddenly appearing at his engagement party, envelope in hand, delivering a statement that landed like a bomb in the gentle afternoon. Thomas remained frozen, his face drained of color. I could see the calculations behind his eyes, not emotion but consequence. And Savannah, the young woman who thought she was stepping into a fairy tale, now stood pale, her lips trembling as if she couldn't believe what she had just heard. "What are you talking about?" Savannah asked, her voice cracking, though she tried to hold on to her pride. I looked at her, calm and cold. "I'm saying this house, that ring on your finger, and everything you thought you were going to build with Thomas, they all come with conditions. Conditions he chose to ignore." Thomas snatched the envelope from the nearby guest's hand, tearing it open so quickly he nearly ripped the paper. His eyes scanned the printed document, firm text bearing the dark blue notary seal of the law office. "No way," he murmured. "My father wouldn't do this." "He did," I interrupted, gently but firmly, "since 2018, because he saw this coming. And he wasn't going to let someone like you, a man willing to abandon his wife of nearly 20 years for a fleeting affair, walk away with everything he spent a lifetime protecting." Savannah turned to Thomas, her expression shifting from confused to furious. "You knew about this?" she shouted. "Did you know and try to hide it from me?" No, Thomas stammered, panicked. "I never reread the will. I thought everything was already settled." That only poured gasoline on the fire. A few guests began to drift away, whispers trailing behind them. I recognized familiar faces, friends who once dined in my living room, now unable to meet my eyes. One of Thomas's business partners, Mr. Kendrick, stepped forward, his expression stern. "Thomas, if what Miss Isabella says is true, announcing an engagement here was a serious misstep. This property is not legally yours." Thomas looked frozen. Savannah didn't. She stepped back, looking at him as if seeing a stranger. "You lied to me," she said through gritted teeth. "You promised me everything was settled. You said she signed the divorce papers, that it was done. You said she had nothing." I smiled softly, not out of satisfaction but because the truth had finally found its voice. "He was right about one thing," I said, turning to Savannah. "I didn't take anything from him, but that doesn't mean he gets to keep what was never rightfully his." Savannah suddenly pulled off the ring and threw it to the ground. It bounced off a stone tile and rolled toward the lavender bushes I had planted during a visit to Walter with Thomas last year. Without another word, she turned and walked away, heels striking the stone path in angry rhythm. I stood still, listening to the now silent band, the murmurs of a stunned crowd. No one laughed, no more congratulations. I didn't need to say another word. The papers in Thomas's hand, his pale expression, and the stares from every guest told the whole story. I left the party the same way I arrived. Quietly, confidently, without anyone opening a path or seeing me out. As the iron gate closed behind me, I heard Thomas call out, "Isabella, wait." But I didn't stop. I didn't turn back, because everything I needed to say had been said, and what he needed to hear, he would have to live with it, day by day, hour by hour. I got into my car, feeling as light as the late spring breeze. Not because I won, but because I stood my ground. No longer a shadow in someone else's story. 2 days after the engagement party, the first voicemail from Thomas appeared at 6:17 a.m. His voice was tired, raspy. "Isabella, we need to talk. Please call me back." I didn't call. Not out of hate, but because I had nothing left to say. Everything had already been said in front of dozens of witnesses, among blessings that never finished landing. By noon I got a call from Walter. "You did the right thing," he said, voice calm but slightly shaky with age. "They just received the letter from my attorney this morning. Thomas is probably losing it." I pictured it, Thomas, hands shaking, holding the envelope sealed by the Caldwell and Rowe Law Office, where Walter once served as honorary counsel, reading the formal confirmation that the entire estate, including the Bend house, the Wyoming ranch, and 70% of the Caldwell Family Investment Fund, would be transferred to the Caldwell Education Foundation if the will's condition wasn't met. And that condition now was irreversible. He had thrown himself off the inheritance chair with the speed of someone too eager to consider the consequences. By the afternoon I received word from Alyssa. The board of directors at Thomas's company had decided to suspend him temporarily pending investigation for potentially withholding personal information that affected the company's image, partly due to the failed engagement at the estate, which had drawn local press attention over ownership disputes, but mostly because in finance, they need people who assess risk, not those who set their own bridges on. An old friend of ours, Nora, now working in internal communications, sent me a screenshot from the internal email thread. "We regret the recent events involving Mr. Caldwell and are conducting a thorough review of his role within the organization." It ended with the familiar line, "We appreciate your patience and will provide updates as available." In other words, Thomas was being iced out of the position he had spent his whole career climbing toward. That same afternoon I received a call from an unknown number. A woman's voice came through, measured and slow. "Ms. Turner, I'm a legal representative of the Caldwell Foundation. You are not entitled to any portion of the estate per the will. But Mr. Walter asked us to extend his deepest thanks. Because of you, what he feared most did not come to pass." I smiled gently, looking out at the garden where the lilacs had just started blooming. "I don't want anything from the estate," I replied. "I just wanted the truth back, and peace for myself." That night I reopened old design files, program models from when I worked with nonprofits in Portland, things I had let go of to follow Thomas wherever he needed. I wrote to Judith, asking about opportunities in strategic consulting for educational and community organizations. She called me back the same day. "We're expanding the department," she said, "and the young folks here could learn a lot from someone like you, Isabella." I laughed, not out of pride but from the feeling of returning to myself, a woman who once had passion, once dared to dream, and once chose sacrifice. The next morning I walked to my usual cafe, where the barista still remembered I ordered sugar-free lattes and strawberry waffles. As I sat down, Michael, my neighbor and once one of Thomas's closest friends, approached with his coffee. "Heard last weekend. Shocked a lot of people," he said, sitting across from me. "I'm not surprised," I replied, sipping my drink. "I just didn't expect to feel this free." Michael was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Are you okay?" I nodded. "For the first time in years, I really am." He smiled. "That's good. If you ever need someone to talk to or a backup gardener, I'm available." I looked at him and smiled. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew this. I was no longer the woman quietly waiting for an apology. I had stepped out of someone else's shadow, and I was writing the final chapter of my story. With my own hand, no one else's. I officially completed my final round of radiation on a July morning. Dr. Harper entered the treatment room, her usual soft smile on her face, and gently removed the lead apron from my shoulders. "Congratulations, Miss Isabella, today's your last session," she said. "And the good news is, all your numbers look really promising." I nodded, smiling softly. There were no claps, no colorful balloons like the photos on social media, just sunlight pouring through the window and a lightness slowly spreading through my chest. I had survived, not just the illness, but the life I used to live. That afternoon I went to City Hall and submitted paperwork to restore my maiden name, Isabella Turner. The woman behind the counter looked at me over her reading glasses and asked, "Divorce?" I nodded. She stamped the form with a loud thud and smiled, as if she'd seen many women walk the same path. "Welcome back to yourself, Ms. Turner," she said. I walked out of the building, my steps light, as if I had just shed a suit of armor I'd worn for years. From that moment on, I was no longer Thomas Caldwell's wife, no longer living in the shadow of a man who thought he could steer someone else's life with credit cards and a well-timed smile. That night, I called Judith. I changed my name back, I said, holding my first glass of red wine in months since treatment began. Good. So, are you ready for the next chapter? She asked, her voice carrying that familiar challenge. I laughed. I've been thinking about your offer. What are you waiting for? Judith continued. Our office is short on someone to manage the community grant program. You've got the experience, you've got the heart, and now you've got a story that can truly inspire. 3 weeks later, I officially returned to work. The nonprofit's office was housed in an old red brick building overlooking the central square of downtown Eugene. Not as fancy as where Thomas used to work, but it gave me something I thought I had lost. I was assigned to lead a financial aid program for underprivileged girls pursuing college. At the first meeting, when I introduced myself as Isabella Turner, a few people in the room looked slightly startled, maybe because the name had appeared in the news a few times recently. But no one mentioned Thomas, not a single question about what happened. They only cared about what I could do, and what I wanted to build for the future. I knew, in that moment, I was no longer just a name in a headline divorce. I had stepped out of that old story, and was writing a new one, with my own hands. The days that followed were filled with busy, vibrant work. I met with donors, organized workshops, visited rural schools, and listened to the quiet dreams of girls, hoping for a future beyond where they were born. Every time I saw that spark of belief in their eyes, I felt like I was coming back to life. On weekends, I tended to the backyard garden that had been neglected all winter. I planted lavender and mint, not for the memories, but because their soft fragrance brought me peace. Michael, my neighbor who still dropped by with coffee in hand, helped me rebuild the rotted trellis. He didn't say much, just smiled and handed me tools when I needed a hammer or a pot of soil. One evening as we were watering the plants, he asked quietly, "Do you ever feel regret?" I looked toward the sunset, then replied, "Not regret. Just sometimes I wonder why I didn't start sooner." He nodded, and didn't ask anything else. I knew there would still be hard days ahead. Scars don't fade in just one summer. But I wasn't afraid of the dark anymore. I had lived in it long enough to know that sometimes it's in the dark where we find our truest light. And this time, that light came from within me. One early autumn Sunday morning, as the maple leaves turned golden and the air carried a crisp Oregon chill, I received a strange envelope in my mailbox. No return address, just a simple handwritten note. For Isabella Turner. Inside was a small card and an old velvet blue box. The card read, "I thought you should have this. Thank you for reminding me what really matters. Signed, Thomas." Inside the box were the turquoise earrings I had lost during a trip to Jackson Hole 10 years ago. Back then, I'd thought they were gone for good. I froze for a moment. Not because of their value, but because of what it meant that Thomas had kept them all these years, and had now chosen to return them. I picked up my phone, typed out a message, then deleted it. It took me a few days to feel ready. When I finally called him, Tomas's voice was deeper, slower. I realized, maybe we had both become different people. "I didn't think you'd call," he said without a trace of blame. "I didn't think I would either," I replied, "but I think some things deserve to be closed the right way." We agreed to meet somewhere familiar, Mirror Lake, a quiet spot we had once visited during the early days of dating when we were still dreaming of a simple future. That afternoon I drove through roads covered in fallen leaves, and arrived just as the sun dipped behind the distant pines. Thomas was already there, sitting on a wooden bench near the lake, holding 2 cups of gas station coffee, the kind we used to drink on weekend drives. He looked different, thinner, a few gray strands in his hair, a plain gray sweater, and the old watch I'd given him on our 15th anniversary, no longer gleaming. But his eyes, for the first time in a long time, held a softness that wasn't guarded. "It's good to see you," he said, handing me the coffee. "You too," I said, sitting down with just enough space between us to breathe easily. We looked out over the still lake, where the trees reflected perfectly in the water. Neither of us spoke for a few minutes. Just the wind and the faint sound of migrating birds in the distance. "I've lost a lot," Thomas finally said. "My job, my reputation, the person I thought I'd build a new life with. But what I regret most is losing you before I realized how much you actually did for me." I turned to him, eyes steady. "I don't blame you anymore. I was angry, yes, But then I realized, if I keep carrying resentment, I'll never have room for hope. He nodded. I deserved to lose everything, but you didn't. You deserve a better life. One no one can take from you. I looked back at the lake, the warm glow of sunset tinting the water a soft orange. I found myself again, Thomas. I rebuilt from scratch, with nothing but my scars and my strength. I don't need anything from you, or from that past. He didn't reply, he just sat quietly as if he'd been waiting to hear those words for months. Finally I stood up. Thank you for returning the earrings, I said with a faint smile. I'm not keeping them for their worth, I'm keeping them because they're the final piece I needed to close that chapter. Thomas stood too, placing a hand over his chest. I don't expect forgiveness, but if you can, I hope you'll remember that at one point, I did truly love you. I nodded and walked back to my car, without looking back. On the drive home, I didn't feel the heaviness I thought I might. There were no tears, no dramatic goodbye, just peace, and a quiet stillness in my heart. I didn't turn around to look at Mirror Lake. I didn't need to. Because I knew, in the end, I had written the ending to my own story, one that didn't carry pain and didn't need revenge. Only freedom, and a completely new beginning. From my story, I've learned that sometimes, loss is the doorway to true freedom. I once gave up myself for a marriage that seemed perfect, until it broke, and forced me to face who I really was. But in the darkest of days, I rediscovered my value, my strength, and my long-lost dreams. Happiness doesn't come from holding on to someone, it comes from being brave enough to walk away, and rewriting your life in the most honest way possible. What do you think about Isabella's journey? Do you relate to her decision? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to follow the channel for more heartfelt, meaningful stories about life and family.